It's unique. It's a unique challenge to give a lecture about your work to a group of people that are potentially already so familiar with me. But that said, I tend to not talk about my own work in my classes very much, and so I'm seeing this as an opportunity to dive more deeply into the projects that I've been doing and kind of allow you to see a lot more than I would normally share in class. So I would like to use this time to try to trace the integration and threads of various themes that have gone throughout all of my work over the last 15 years. So I decided I'm going to just back way up to my senior show here at Biola and go speed forward to where we're at today. And I'm going to do a lot of reading from my notes because I think I prefer to write, and I do better when I write. And if you're one of my students, you know that I will ramble a lot if I go off of script. So you don't want to put up with that tonight. So I will stick to that. No, that's perfect. That's actually just right. So, all right, cool. My purpose and my desire in going through so much of my work is twofold. First, my work has always been about my personal journey through life, and it seems only fitting to start towards the beginning and take you along on parts of that journey, and to tell you some of the stories that go behind all that work. But also my purpose in doing this is specifically for the students and young artists that are out here tonight. I want to speak to the process of learning how to see certain threads in your work that can be traced throughout all of it and throughout all of your lives, and to start to think about how those threads connect, and think, what are the key things that repeat in your life? What are the key things that make you curious, that reappear over and over in your work and persist in your mind and in your heart? I think the strongest work that we can make comes from understanding what is uniquely important to you, understanding where your story is, how your story informs your life, and therefore how your story seeps through all of your work. So, for me, my story is that of a search for home, a journey to find a sense of belonging, a sense of place, and ultimately a deep desire to find a connection to family and community. Let me read something that the poet John Lex wrote about the connection between place and story, and why focusing on story can be an important and helpful way to navigate contemporary culture. A sense of place is not sentimental. It is practical and necessary. The mistake is to consider place provincially. While a sense of place is based on local knowledge, it's not limited to local knowledge. It includes a range of places. What is one caught in the forced mobility of our urban culture to do? The answer lies in story. Though I may be out of my place, I am not out of my story. I was born and raised in Minnesota, a place where both sides of my family have lived for generations. And although I loved Minnesota, I always daydreamed of being elsewhere. As a child, I had my imagination captured by watching endless films and TV shows. I pored over National Geographic magazines, and I was so fascinated by maps that I never put down the World Atlas. My family would travel to Disney World every year during my childhood, from ages 5 to 18, and I was more obsessed with that place than I can possibly express. So much so that I drew maps of it in my childhood bedroom, which you can see in the exhibition if you've been in there. These yearly trips to Disney World were my first experience of pilgrimage. It's an ancient term that I like to use when talking about my life and my work. And I now see how these trips as a child trained me in the concept of making regular visits to a special place. In this case, the place was both an escape and yet also a place of deep connection. If you've seen the exhibition, you know that all this comes into play in the center installation, but I'm going to hit pause on that for now, and we'll come back to that idea a little bit later. So, at a young age, and throughout my childhood until I was about 18, I became accustomed to this disorienting tension of place and displacement. I had a home and a family and a community in Minnesota, but I was strangely disconnected, and I felt very restless. I actually felt more connected when I was away than when I was at home. So it was no surprise to me that when I decided pretty easily to move far away after high school to attend college, and I came here to Biola, where I found a new home and a new family in the form of this community of fellow art majors and professors. And it was also not surprising when the themes of pilgrimage and displacement came out in my senior show here at Biola. Many of you have asked over the years to see some of the images from it, so now's the time that I will show you some of them. So this project was called Descend Onward. And what you're looking at are 16 by 20 black and white photos printed in the darkroom. And then there are small color transparencies cut into them as light boxes. The content of the photos is a combination of ancient and contemporary pilgrimage images. The black and white images are ancient Celtic pilgrimage sites throughout England and Scotland, and the color images are a contemporary daily grind of the London Underground. And then I also, well, here's a detail shot, so you can see a little more of what's going on there. And then also, aside from making wall pieces like that, I also made some walk-through installations. They were projections, and in the space, your shadow and your figure would interact in a similar mix of black and white and color imagery that was a lot like the light boxes, but it was like you were in a living, life-size version of one. And so you would literally walk through these corridors and embark on an active pilgrimage. And this is a view of what it looks like as you were standing in the space and your shadow is in the way. And if you happen to be in there with others, you would see more of the imagery actually as it was projected on their backs. That's John. So, let's see. So after graduation, I stayed here in California and I became a teacher. And over time, I became very deeply rooted in my local community in Long Beach, where I moved. However, despite a growing sense of feeling rooted there, I continued to spend most of my 20s as a pilgrim, traveling away to various places, looking for points of connection, moments of understanding about myself and my story. I lump a lot of my work from that time into a project called Driftwood, and so I have a couple of images from that here that I'll just quickly go through. I don't really have time to say much about any of these, but they're just generally somewhat disconnected images that are unified in their sense of wanderlust and what I like to think of as a sacred discontent. They're just strange pictures, and they all seem to have a certain oddness, some sort of sacred oddness to them. I don't know. It's actually still an unfinished series. Someday I'll go back to it. All right. That brings us to Northwoods journals. Eventually, it dawned on me that Minnesota was now the away place, now that I've been living out here. It was now the place that I would return to visit every year, just like I would return to visit Disney World as a child. Since moving away at age 18, I've returned to Minnesota twice each year for the last 17 years. And with each visit, I found myself compelled to photograph this strange merger of myth and memory that was occurring. At first, it was about capturing the seasons that I missed so much. Snowy landscapes, densely wooded forests, open spaces. But I realized that those photos were pretty boring. They had no weight. They had no sense of story. And it was the absence of story, or perhaps more specifically, the withholding and concealing of story that became the seed of my Northwoods Journals project as it evolved into the body of work that you see in the gallery now. There's two main things I'd want to say about Minnesota. The first is that it's a nice place. And I just mean nice, like everyone is just plain nice. That's what we're known for. There's a thing, it's called Minnesota Nice. And it's the oh yeah, you betcha stuff, you know, like oh yeah. Everyone's so agreeable about everything, oh yeah. But really, it's just a way, I think, often of masking an ocean of passive-aggressive feelings and a whole vault of personal secrets. So that's the niceness. So the thesis image of sorts for the project came together in this photo. And it touches on that idea of masking something and covering something. This photo is entitled Not to be Opened Until My Death, which is what's written on the front side of it. And you're looking at the back side of it. So let me give you some context. I've always had a fascination with preserving and digging through old family photos, especially photos that were before me or didn't involve me. It was my way of kind of piecing together parts of the story that I didn't know. Learning the storyline that I was part of that I wasn't really told much about. My family doesn't tell many stories. Quite the opposite. Their tendency has been to bury the past, leaving this game of digging through photos and listening carefully for hints of what happened before me. And that's where this envelope fits in. I'll take a minute here to read from a short narrative that I've written about this particular photo. This is actually an extended version of what's written in the gallery statement. I must have been about 10 or 11 years old when I first ran across the peculiar haunted envelope that bore my grandmother's shaky handwriting, not to be opened until my death. Tucked in her top dresser drawer amidst other valuables, its striking phrase burned into my memory at a young age. I don't know exactly when, and I don't know how often, but I know I visited the envelope numerous times, pondering what could be inside. What could be so important or tragic that it must be kept secret in this way? Still, by that age, I had learned that there are many things that should not be spoken about. When I was 16, the sisters gathered in our house to read the contents. I stood at my bedroom door listening in vain to try to hear the conversation. I couldn't shake the hold that piece of paper had over me. But of course, it wasn't right to ask. I must have been in my mid-20s when I encountered it next. Accidentally, upon digging through family documents. In an unexpected and anticlimactic moment, I read the contents and was left with a profound sadness that such things couldn't be said among the living. At age 32, I photographed it, still trying to break its spell, but the patterns run deep and so many of these stories are still in the grave. As I write in the exhibition statement, this became so much more than just a letter and an envelope. I was haunted by what it represented. It's loaded with a latent meaning, and yet it's withholding its story. And to me, that represents my experience of growing up in Minnesota. I realized that my photographs from Minnesota, no matter how diverse their subject matter, were all really at their core a search to decipher and to understand family stories, and a search to see how those stories informed my own story. The longer that I have been away from Minnesota, the more that I've felt this disconnect and an incredible difference between my urban life here in Southern California and the life that I had left behind. That life is embodied by my brother, whose family appears in most of these photographs. Although we grew up in a suburb of Minneapolis, St. Paul, our family roots go deep into the folklore of the Midwest. My grandpa was a lumberjack who traveled with the timber as he cut it down and moved on to the next city. My dad grew up in a town of a couple hundred people where his brother, who dropped out of school in 9th grade, eventually became the mayor of that town. I started driving when I was 6. That's when I plowed a Volkswagen Beetle into a tree in the woods. And it's pretty much those kind of stories that put an end to my own Northwoods folklore. Pretty much after that, I became the city kid who was raised in the suburbs and the first person in my family to go to college. So the disconnect just kind of started to grow between the mythology of what I was raised around and then the way that my life was going. My brother, however, has chosen to do everything he possibly can to return to the nostalgic, simpler life that my grandfather would have led. He has a large plot of land on a river in rural central Minnesota by Pine City. And his kids are able to drive cars, ride dirt bikes and snowmobiles, and drive things into trees just like we used to do. And they have all sorts of animals just for fun, just because they can. So that brings me back to a second thing I kind of want to say about Minnesota. It is a weird and bizarre place. It's a funny place. Like I was saying earlier, it's nice, but it's also weird and funny with this dark sense of humor. Perhaps this is how everyone deals with all their pent-up stories, is by letting it out with some sort of dry humor and wit. I think about Garrison Keillor and Prairie Home Companion, or the Coen brothers and Fargo. There's a lot of this, pent up something coming out in really bizarre humor. So in this way, I owe a lot of the success of some of these images to my brother and his really twisted mind. Like that. Everyone always wants to know the stories of some of these pictures. There aren't really a lot of stories. This is just how he is. He just does these things. It's normal to him. He has a really funny sense of humor. This year, there's always a rat problem when you live in the woods. And so he caught every rat that he captured in the kitchen and strung it up outside so that it would freeze in whatever position it was left in, and serve as a scarecrow to all the other rats out there, stay away. And then he realized that I had taken a picture of it and was getting some attention for that picture, so then it kind of egged him on and he had to do better. So in this year, he one-upped it by making a wreath out of the rats that he had caught that year. He actually was saving these rats, by the way. There was a bucket full of them, and they were frozen outside. So there's actually 5 rats around this one. They're all zip-tied to it. And I focused on the mother-child nativity at the top because I thought that was the most tender part. So. And this was for my mom. This was basically all the kids got together and they did this as a little thing for Grandma, and my mom was terrified. And then an hour later, the dog ate it. So he ate all 5 of the rats. So yeah. And there's chickens too, but I didn't put this one in the show, so we won't get into that. But this is how you get your meals. These sort of things happen. So there we go. Okay, switching gears. So I've described this show as being a journey to piece together a disconnected family narrative that's marked by secrets, weathered by seasons, colored with dry humor, and haunted by death. And as such, it seems appropriate to install this photograph, Norma's Bible, in the way that I did in the gallery. The Bible actually belongs to my other grandmother, my dad's mother, not the one who wrote the letter in the envelope. But she appears to have been similarly haunted by secrets, something that I gather from the way that she frequently underlined and circled some of the darkest passages in Scripture, including Psalm 69 and 70, where she also noted at the top as having read over and over. It says, "Save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck." Or in another translation, it says, "The waters are come unto my soul. I sink in deep mire where there is no standing. I have come into deep waters where the floods overflow me. I am weary of my crying. My throat is dried. My eyes fail while I wait for God." Death really does hang over this body of work, along with its friends' guilt, shame, fear, and secrecy. But it's been interesting for me to notice that almost intuitively, without ever really trying, the work has always tempered itself with other elements. And those could be things like color or humor or kind of raw beauty, or stories that have as much hope in them as they also have tragedy in them. For example, this photo. It's often a favorite with a lot of people, and usually that's because people enjoy how beautiful it is or how cute it is that she has dirty feet and stuff like that, which is great because that's all definitely part of it, and I want people to connect to it at that level. But the photo also holds a much heavier story. This is my niece Brooke, and when she was 2 years old, she drowned in this river. She survived, as you can tell, because she's about 5 in this photo. But when she was 2, she crawled out onto the frozen river in the winter, broke through it, and my sister-in-law found her floating face down. She was airlifted out and essentially had been dead for a little while, but miraculously woke up from her coma with no brain damage and an uncanny ability to sense the supernatural. So for me, this photo contains all of that. The danger is present in that awkwardly big and bright orange life preserver. But likewise, so is all the beauty and the hope that's also present in her story. I'm often asked if this project is finished, especially when it shows like this in a huge kind of single exhibition. But that's a really difficult question for me to answer. It's hard to say if it ever will be finished, because I keep taking photos every time I go back there. But conceptually, it has become a very clear and concise project in my mind, and I think that's narrowed down more than it ever has before. Among the tens of thousands of photos that I've taken in Minnesota over the years, I've chosen to bring together a set of them that speak to the constant tension of connection and disconnection that I feel from this place and from these people that used to be home. And this is a really recent thought that I just came up with actually throughout the week thinking about this. But there's something about this photo that feels a little bit final to me. It's new, so I'm not really sure what it's telling me yet. I just shot this about 3 months ago. And as soon as I looked at it, I knew that something different was going on with this one. My nephew is going to be 13 soon, and the gravity of his expression in this brought out a sense of maturity that I didn't really know what to deal with because I'm used to thinking of these guys as little kids. And I think it started to feel like a bookend. And I've referred to it as a self-portrait. I think it is very much a self-portrait. And I think that has something to do with maybe why it feels like maybe a bookend that I'm starting to close the chapter of what I'm talking about with this project. I don't know if I'll keep photographing my brother's kids into their teens, and if I do, it might be an altogether different project. And that'd be great, because I'm at a point now where I'm really open to the idea of Northwoods journals being a series of interconnected projects, maybe multiple volumes. So that also brings me back to addressing the Disney photos. For this exhibition in particular, I knew that I had the space and the opportunity to experiment and play. In fact, calling the exhibition Home is Where was an intentional choice on my part. It's a different title than the series title. And that was to allow myself more freedom to explore larger ideas of home beyond just what's present in Northwoods journals. Specifically, as I thought about this show, I couldn't get Disney World out of my head. And that's mostly because back in February of this year, I went back there for the first time in 15 years. And it was a really strange feeling. It overwhelmed me, actually, how much it felt like more of a homecoming than any trip to Minnesota has. And I suppose that makes sense because we went there so often that it really was a type of home for me. It was a place of home. And in fact, it's the type of home that promises to be the happiest place on earth. But still, even with that, I was overwhelmed with how much warmth I felt towards that place, even after so long. Excuse me. So, what do? Of course? I take cold and detached photos of it. While I was there, but they're nice, cold, detached ones. Yeah, exactly. I feel so much warmth. Let me just make this place look miserable. I always shoot with my intuition, and while I was there, I just kind of let my intuition take over. And this is just usually how I do things about 90% of the time. And I would find myself stopping to shoot certain locations that either struck me as significant or important or memorable, but I didn't really know why. They could have been for joyful reasons, maybe even for sorrowful reasons. Disney, after all, wasn't always the happiest place on earth for me. Real life snuck in there too. But for the most part, it was still my place of escape and a place where I could construct an alternate version of home for myself. Most of these images ended up having an eerie sense of emptiness and isolation to them, which again was more intuitive than intentional, but it does make sense. I wanted each photograph to act as a placeholder for memory, for unseen or possibly even forgotten moments. But even with that creepy sense of unreality and emptiness, I still feel more warmth from these than I do from many of the photos of my actual home. It was also really intuitive for me to install them the way that I did in that little room that's meant to act as sort of a makeshift bedroom, or at least reference my childhood bedroom, which in real life was actually covered in images of Disney, Disney movies, photos from Disney World. Although the images in the main gallery walls represent the real homeland that I lived in, the images inside the paneled room are a much closer representation of the world that existed in my head. And I'll say one more thing about these new Disney images. They're still new. They're really odd for me to show, actually, because for someone like me who tends to take years to develop a project, I'm throwing these things out in public after they're about 9 months old. I'm sure at some point it'll expand into its own project, into its own independent series, but for now it's just kind of fun to experiment and see how they connect to my older work. So, speaking of older work, in the short amount of time I had left, oops, I skipped that one there. I'd like to kind of come back to the idea of story that I opened up with, and noticing common threads that run between all of my work. Concurrent with this Northwoods Journals project, I've also been working on 2 other projects that, though they appear quite different in content and subject matter, share some very similar themes and connections to my story. So the first of these is called A Thin Silence. In part, because of the disconnect that I feel towards my family in Minnesota, I've always felt myself in search of deeper connections with friends and within a greater community. I'm fascinated by community living and by people who choose to intentionally share their lives together, whether that means literally sharing income and living space, or whether that just refers to a deep commitment to be involved in each other's lives like a family would be. And it's also no secret that I hate the idolatry of the American dream. I hate the idea that the supreme goal of life is to have your spouse and children and home and fence and retirement fund and all the things that end up often, not always, but often, isolating people into a sense of safety. We even talk about it in sense of moving onward or moving upward to nicer neighborhoods. And typically that means away from neighbors that might annoy you with their less than tidy lives. It becomes about you and your family making it, or in the case of my brother, escaping it, one or the other. He's isolating in the woods, having his American dream. And I'm not judgmental necessarily about that, I am, but it's different for me. So as a single person at age 36, I'm out of that mold of the norm. I've spent most of my life instead seeking to find deep connections with other people in less traditional ways. I'm usually the 3rd wheel or the 5th wheel or the 7th wheel with all of my married friends, and it's actually something that I enjoy. I have the time and the availability to visit friends in faraway places and keep those friendships vital and alive, and that's a really great thing. But still, everyone needs some sense of home or some sense of belonging. And at the end of the day, being single does get lonely. So I've spent much of the last 10 years on this quest to explore alternate ways of living life with other people in community. This quest has given birth to this project entitled A Thin Silence. So I'll read from the artist statement that I use with these images. A Thin Silence is a body of work that comes from my experience of living at the L'Abri communities in England and Sweden. L'Abri is a French word that means the shelter, and it is a place where people of all ages and nationalities come to rest, for study and for rest, in a shared community life with others. It is a thin place, to use an old Celtic expression, a place where the veil between heaven and earth is almost transparent, a place where pilgrims go to wrestle with God and ask tough questions that many are otherwise afraid to ask. There's a story in the Old Testament about expecting God to be revealed in a dramatic gesture, like an earthquake or a fire, but instead finding that God reveals himself in what's called a low whisper or a thin silence. This is the lesson of L'Abri. Those who come here are hoping for grand redemption from personal demons, but often instead find God in the beauty of little things, like chores and shared meals. In a world of individualism and isolationism, many are seeking a sense of belonging, and immersing oneself in the rhythm of a life together in a place like this can provide a needed contrast from the lonely wanderlust of our society. Those of us who make the pilgrimage to places like this tend to discover a new sense of home, a new sense of place where we can slow down and focus on being instead of doing, basically stop doing and learn to start being. L'Abri has locations all around the globe, and it's a really rare and special kind of place. In my times there, I've come to learn the simple pleasures of life shared with others, the significance of little things like meals, laundry, and toilet cleaning. It's not a hippie commune, though, and it's not a spiritual retreat center, nor is it a place that's isolated and hiding from culture like my brother in the woods. Quite the opposite. L'Abri encourages its visitors to grapple with the tough questions of real life and then to leave, to go back to their communities and bring this new life and these new ideas to bear on the realities of their own lives in real situations. It's a place where the other is more important than the self, and where life is about more than our own success and happiness. It's about actually living life together in a way that causes people to flourish and become a new family and new community. The images that I've shot here focus mostly on the space itself, the residue and the evidence of people in this community. For the most part, I chose not to include the people that were actually living there with me, because I wanted this to be a little more universal, as if you were placing yourself into the scenes. They're certainly more idyllic and kind of traditionally beautiful images than a lot of my other work, but I think they still carry a lot of the same pregnant pauses that are found in some of my other work. I made 3 visits to L'Abri, and I stayed 2 to 4 weeks each time. And as much as I loved being in that special place, and as much as I loved really the people that I've met there from all around the world, it really is, like I said, about taking these things back and taking the lessons you learn back to your own communities. So with a deep gratitude, I can really say that I'm thankful to have a great network of friends in Long Beach and here in Southern California that is trying to live the sort of life that we see at L'Abri and trying to take some of those lessons, a life where each person is really respected for their own story and given an identity of belonging that allows them to flourish. So there's a lot of images I could show you from this, but you'll just have to go onto my website to see some more of them. Just wanted to give you a little tease of that. And then basically bring you into my latest body of work, which is a very different direction and a new series that's very much still in progress. At first, this was just an exercise to stretch myself as a teacher and as an artist. I'd never really done portraits before, and I thought, well, I want to try to do portraits. As I continued to do it, I saw all the connections that started forming to the rest of my work and decided to take it a lot more seriously as a major project. So I keep talking about story, and specifically, I keep talking about living into your own story, because I really think it's the place where good art and good life comes from. The more that I've come to embrace and embody and live out the things that are unique to my story, the more that I've found a richness and a fullness to life, and the more that I've found things to photograph that come out of those deep passions. So that's really where this project, which I call I Love You Man, comes from. It's a celebration of deep, amazing friendships that I have. Men who have decided that it's significant and important to them to maintain multiple important friendships in their community. Men who have not isolated off with families of their own, but instead open their lives up more and more. I'm very grateful to have a lot of really deep friendships in my life that are both male and female. But specifically with this project, I chose to honor the male friendships because I think that I'm part of more intimate friendships with men than a lot of guys are. And that's something that I would like to see more people be able to have, and so I figured this is something different in my story to share. We've worked really hard to develop a deep trust and are willing to be vulnerable and broken before each other. And as I said, these are people who are saying it's just as important to be devoted to each other as it is to your own families. So that's kind of what it means to me, at least. But as I've discovered with portraiture, it really tends to be a collaborative endeavor. And so for each of these guys, it represents something different. It represents markers of them and their stories and where they're at. 3 of these men in the project are recently married, while 3 more of them are either recently divorced or in stages of divorce. One of these men just welcomed new adoptive children into his home, and another one of these men just lost his home to foreclosure. Some of these men are former students that I've mentored, and some of them are my own mentors. And I've just found it to be a beautiful network of relationships that I'm really grateful to be a part of. And the portraits are just one small way to express that gratitude and to encourage others to consider deeper levels of intimacy and connection with their friendships. So I've just got a couple more of them here. There's a lot more I could say about this project. I've started to unpack it a little bit. I had a chance to speak about it recently and write a whole different lecture about it. So if you guys are interested in more of this one, we could expand that more and more. But basically, I'm gonna wrap up soon here so we can have a lot of time for Q&A. I want to say that it's only within the last couple of years that I've seen a lot of these connected threads in my life and in my story come together. And like I was saying earlier, I think one of the most important bits of advice that I ever see for young artists is to really think about the ways that things connect and repeat and show up in your work. But like I said, this has taken a long time. Northwoods Journals has been a project that's been going on for 11, 12 years, depending on where I start the marker of the start of it. So patience and perseverance definitely do wonders in understanding your work. And I know from teaching here for the last 12 years that young artists can often get really discouraged by lack of ideas. There's pressure to constantly have a new idea for your new project, or to get discouraged by confusion over what to make. And I figure that if you're in that place, that's a good thing, and basically don't worry about it. The thing for me has been to just keep living, keep writing your story, keep following what is unique to you. Do what you love, do what you're curious about, follow what you're curious about. Pursue what you're passionately excited about, and pursue what you're frustrated by and terrified of. Essentially just live and keep making stuff. It's not really that complex of advice. I think if you really keep making stuff, keep taking pictures, keep making art, keep living artfully, you're gonna be just fine. That's pretty much how I have to end it, is you're gonna be okay. So yeah, that's a big sweeping survey of a lot of work. I guess I can open up for Q&A. I don't know if you would like to say anything first, or?
Do I get the first question?
Sure. Yeah, I'm gonna open it to Q&A and allow Dan to have the first question. And I've got lots of work on here that we could flip to if you'd like to see more. So.
You used a phrase early in the evening, and I'm wondering if you can unpack it a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
It's the sacred discontent.
Hmm.
Because I think, that really struck me, because often
Yeah.
we can hold a sense of discontent in ways that we would hardly call it sacred.
Hmm.
And there's something kind of beautifully redemptive in that phrasing.
Yeah.
It honors it.
Yeah. I'm not sure what to say about it.
What do you mean when you say that?
I think it's like I just said at the end there, it's gonna be okay. I basically just think it's okay to fight with God and argue with him and swear at him a lot, because I do. And so I think he can handle that, and I think he can handle how pissed off we are at the way life goes sometimes. And so I think that actually draws you closer. And so maybe that's the sacred discontent for me, is this idea of like just learning to be okay with frustration and questioning and discontent, and seeing that it's a healthy process actually, and can be a healthy process. It can be an incredibly detrimental process too, but if done well and in community with others, I think it can be a healthy process. Yeah. Oh. All right. So, yeah, there we go. So shout them out. All right.
Okay, so your work is intensely personal.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess my question is just, what is that like to show work like that? I don't know.
Yeah. No, that's a good question. We had a faculty talk earlier today with the greater university faculty, and over and over people were asking me that afterwards, of like, what's it like to just expose all of this? And I don't know, maybe I'm just a freak, but I don't mind. Like, I just kind of like, I'm okay with that vulnerability. I think there's certainly, there's a benefit to deciding what is private and a benefit to deciding what is only shared with certain people. But I think I've never been able to make art that isn't personal. Like it just comes out. It just keeps happening. And so if I was going to make impersonal art, it would actually be really difficult for me. And I think I decided way back as a student to stop fighting that sort of impulse and allow my work to be personal. And it certainly is, there's a delicate dance of how much you say in certain contexts and how much you need to say because the work is saying its own thing. Like, I think that bad personal work is work that doesn't reach the rest of you guys and doesn't make sense to other viewers. Or work that I've said too much about. I can overshare and make the work too personal and then it doesn't connect to you guys. But there's a certain amount of stuff that's personal that's also universal, and I think really touches on things that everyone can relate to.
Yeah,
Yeah.
There's a specificity to your stories,
Mm-hmm.
but you have framed them and in such a way that there's a place,
Hmm.
I think, for all of us as viewers to locate our own stories. Right?
Hmm. Yeah.
What are the secrets in our families? What are the delights in our families? What are the tensions in our
Yeah.
relationships?
Yeah, and I think, he brought up, if you couldn't quite hear in the back, he was saying there's space to connect this to your own families, to connect this to your own secrets. That's one of the many reasons that I don't ever say what's in the envelope. Everyone often kind of wants to know, like, well, what did your grandma say? Well, first of all, it's none of your business. Secondly, it would kill your connection to it to know, actually, because you put your own content in that envelope. You have your own family secrets that are part of that, so, yeah. So, yeah, all right, Nate. Fellow Minnesotan, shout out. What's up?
Do you feel like you are beginning to or have made a home in Southern California?
Yeah, that's a good question. He's asking if I feel at home here or feel like I've begun to, and I really do think so. I think that's where the portrait project started coming about, was this expression of like, it's only men, and I have men and women that I'm very close with, but it's a way of saying, here's the people that are making this place feel like home. What's funny is I think up until last year when I started that project, I've never really shot pictures in Southern California. And I'm still not shooting pictures about Southern California, but I am sort of in a way, I don't know. It's my way of expressing that there's something happening now that feels more like home. Yeah. Yeah.
You're talking about people make it feel like home and it really feel at home. Is that a winter's definition for you?
Oh, wow. What is home? Home is where the cat is. That's actually what that cushion says. I normally don't give that away, but I just did. So home is where it comes from, that little couch cushion, if you can see it in the middle there. And yeah, it says home is where the cat is. Man, that's a good question. I don't know that I can answer that because maybe that's why I keep making artwork about home. Like that's my way of trying to answer it. It's people, it's place, it's a sense of belonging. It's definitely about place, but it's also not about place. It's about the people in that place. And, yeah, I don't know. I think that'll be one of those like, ask me when I'm dead questions maybe, because then I probably will finally have figured out what home is. Yeah. Yeah. Hi, Adam.
How much time do you spend thinking about the images of your pictures and their significance, the way that you frame?
Yeah, how I think about the what about the pictures? Oh yeah, the cropping and framing and I'm pretty intuitive in terms of how I shoot. I don't take a lot of time to think about composition when I shoot, but I'm still very thoughtful about it, and especially when I go back through a bunch of photos, the ones that I choose are the ones I'm thinking the most about, like what's in the frame and what's not in the frame. And I think that like this one, there's this powerful tendency to center a lot of the pictures from this project in particular. The birdhouse is centered, my nephew on the truck is centered. But then I decenter it somehow or kind of like throw that balance off. Try to see if I can find one that maybe, here we go. How about that one? So in terms of cropping, it was important to me to kind of squeeze the United States into this picture. And it's fine if we lose a few things. But like, it was really important that I got Florida in it, and that Florida was also a little bit obscured. And it wasn't that I had to move anything. I just kind of moved myself. These are little trinkets that are actually on a shelf in front of this, and this is in my dad's office. And I wanted it to feel kind of confined and strange, and I wanted you to not quite know what these knickknacks are that are underneath. So, yeah, I think I pay quite a lot of attention to that, and I'm not opposed to cropping things differently in Photoshop or making things disappear that need to disappear. That's all. Like, I tend to not set things up, but I don't get up in arms about changing something, so, yeah. Did that kind of get at it? That kind of is a meandering answer, but.
I like your answer.
Okay, thanks. All right, what's up?
Is there any significance to the fact that it's Mickey and a traveling guide?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like, well, it just happened, but it's significant. Like, it's there. I probably gave that to my dad because there's a million Mickey Mouse things in the house that at some point I gave to my parents, really just for myself. And the like traveling old man for me is significant because my dad was still is a traveling sales representative, and that's his sales territory that he's sharpied. At some point, he added that chunk of the Dakotas when his business was going better. And then he added that little chunk of the lower peninsula of Michigan. And then that trail that kind of just trails off is the route to Florida, but I don't know why, it's just kind of rubbed away. It disappears somewhere in the Appalachians. So, just a beautiful place to get lost, but yeah.
Is there any sense of like the eternal or like what you're longing for?
In the images?
As the string goes out of what you're looking for and what moment and what you're longing for.
He's asking if there's any sense of kind of the eternal or of something that is out there past this kind of on. Is that right? Is that kind of? I'm repeating it for everyone in the back, but.
Yeah, like, I mean, is there anything about that?
I'm sure there is. I don't know that I can point to it. Yeah, I don't know how to. That's a tough one. I don't know how to answer that.
We can talk about it.
Yeah, so like, we'll talk about it later. I think to some extent, let me skip out of this and roll back.
I have some answers in there.
Yeah, I was gonna say like, those are the sort of things where I love to have someone else interpret it, and I would love to hear what someone else thinks. But my one address to that might be this. I don't know of where things are going, but that's really depressing too, actually. But yeah, it is. So, what would you say?
Well, I would say it's fragments of like the I Love You Man series. It's like the locating of things that are both embodied but extend beyond. The idea of deep relationship, but quite
Yeah, yeah,
this sense of the Bree photographs where you're very much in place, but you're simultaneously really conscious of transcendence that's right around you.
yeah. There it is. Could you guys hear that in the back? Excuse me, I just burped into that. What Dan was saying was the idea of like perhaps if there is something that's kind of transcendent or eternal or stretching outward, it's the relationships, it's these portraits, it's the places that are transcendent places, maybe like Labrie. It's things that are outside and around me, maybe as well. Yeah.
Those little kind of moments where light moves back and forth.
Yeah. Yeah. John, I knew you'd have an answer for that one. Yeah.
Well, I mean, just with this series, even without moving into the I Love You Man series, it's an articulation of the longing
Hmm.
factor. This body of work is so full of longing, and the articulation itself of longing is
Yeah.
a gesture. Without answering, without providing, it's a new icon,
Yeah.
the articulation of longing.
Yeah, I think, I mean, he was saying longing, if you can't hear. Longing is probably the theme that's on every single picture I put forward, probably, is some sense of longing. And so it is longing for that,
And there's the
transcendent.
discontent.
Yeah, there we go. Back to the sacred discontent, that longing for something that's not yet fulfilled and is there in pieces. Yeah, Sarah.
I also see your work as really representative of a Christian journey.
Hmm.
This fact that home, we're never going to feel settled at home, or
Hmm.
we should.
Hmm.
And the fact that you keep seeking it in a weird, unusual way, just brought back to this
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Oh, thanks. That's absolutely right. Yeah, that's huge. Yeah. Oh, yeah, Marianne, hey.
Just with this kind of, you throwing it back to social to the question about your art as a practice.
Yeah.
And being that you have a lot of bodies of work that extend over relatively long periods of time.
Mm-hmm.
An age where you can like shoot something, put it up on Tumblr, and that's your body of work.
Yeah.
You really get to let it live. So do you have a place for either maybe like have a studio group of people you don't know, or other artists that you do know, or
Hmm.
do you have a place for getting other people's interpretations of what you're doing to influence your work or how you see your work as you make?
Yeah, I think to repeat what she was asking, she's kind of asking about my practice being so long range that I take forever to do something, basically. But it's true. Like these projects mull and roll over for years, and so how I get some feedback or how I get some influence or who may play into that, and I think a lot of that is. I am definitely getting a lot of feedback, especially in the last couple of years. I've been going to some portfolio reviews and getting some professional feedback from the art world. But I'm always quick to ask everyone everything, I guess. Like I maybe am too heavily reliant sometimes on asking my friends to interpret things for me. Like I don't get this. John, what's happening? You know, basically, he's my go-to for that. So, or Dan will be there too. So, yeah, I think that I actually value kind of a collaborative shaping of the projects, almost like it. I like how if somebody will say something really interesting, it'll actually steer and redirect a project, even a long-term project. And I think it's really important to always kind of stay open to that. Someone might say something that's just absolutely right, and you've got to change course. The river and the Bible as an installation, that was a kind of combination of a number of voices of us in the gallery helping me set up. Seth was in there, and John was in there, and I knew I wanted something in that corner because it's kind of an ugly, dead corner in the gallery, no offense. And it was either going to be the Bible or the river. And I don't remember if it was John or Seth, so it was like, both. I'm like, absolutely, that's what it has to be. It has to be both. So I think like, yeah, getting that feedback and then being willing to let it change course of things is really important to me. Yeah. Yeah, hi Lauren.
How do you find yourself holding your own self
Hmm.
while being over an extended period of time critique on a work that's so personal to you?
Yeah, wow, what a question. I knew something was coming from you like that. If you couldn't hear, she's, how do I kind of hold myself in the midst of doing such personal work and having it critiqued so often and by so many people? I think because I've always done personal work, I'm able to separate it pretty well. Like I don't get hurt by any critique or feedback. I don't know if that's a thick skin or if that's just a skill that's developed over time of like knowing that what you're talking about right now is in the best interest of the work, not necessarily something about me. And so, yeah, I think because I've always made personal work, I've always learned to just have anyone say anything about it and not take it too personally. Yeah, and I think in terms of like holding my own self in the midst of that, that's maybe where the idea of story comes in, and the idea of like coming to grips with or embracing your own story and the parts of your story that you maybe are discontent with or joyful about, and kind of learning to own that and live into that, and then feeling that brings a confidence or a safety.